Today we are going to paint a moonlit, cloudy landscape, and we're going to begin doing so by using a large round-headed brush, taking a little bit of primary blue and titanium white, and scraping on some paint around where we want our moon to be. This is going to act as a bit of a glow, a light emanating from the moon, and it's going to really draw our eye into that center area. The rest of the sky is going to be a little bit darker, as you can see by the black we are applying now, and that's really going to ensure that the eye stays in the lit area, in the center where we want it. So here I'm just kind of going around the edges. All of the blue and white paint is still wet, and so the black is blending into it very easily. But if you're having issues, you can always take a little bit of additional water and apply it to your brush. From there, I'm taking a medium-sized Artist's Loft square-headed brush and creating a round circle. Now, it's not going to be perfectly round initially, but I do work on it and I kind of work on the edges. You see, a square-headed brush is fantastic for doing this sort of thing because it has hard edges. They're very sharp, and so you can render sharp little details around a moon. I ensured to keep the edges of the moon very bright, while the middle of it still has some of the black from the background showing through, and that just really helps create a lot of depth and kind of implies craters and that sort of thing. From there, I'm taking my larger round-headed brush yet again, and I am applying a myriad of little clouds at the base here. Now these are all very rough, and I'm ensuring that I'm using this larger brush because I do want a lot of these rough clouds. I don't want them to all look the same. And this diversity is really going to help make it much more interesting. So I'm kind of just moving my brush in these horizontal lines, but I'm occasionally moving it up and down. I'm making some larger than others, and I'm leaving spaces in between these lines. And that's just going to imply that, you know, the land drops off, or the sky and the clouds drop off in varying areas. Now I'm picking a couple of those areas. Although the clouds aren't finished, I'm going to take a square-headed brush like the one I used in the moon, and I'm going to begin drawing on some mountains. I began with a very neutral gray, and now I'm going in with a black and adding all of my shadows. As you can see, by working with varying lines, you kind of have these grooves and movements within the mountains which really help it look a little bit more real. I'm also going to make one very large in the foreground here, and it's going to get lost underneath the clouds in the foreground, both at the bottom and at the top. And this is going to look interesting because it's just going to create an extra layer of depth. If you really want to create depth in your landscape, make sure you're taking varying items like clouds and putting them in the very far background, and also put them in the foreground. Put mountains in the background, maybe put some in the foreground. And by having that difference, you can see different textures in the way light hits it differently, and different levels of contrast, and it'll just make the painting so much more interesting. Then finally, I'm taking a very bright highlight. It has a lot more white, but the brush is still kind of dirty from the blacks and the grays, and so as you can see, it isn't a pure white like the moon. From there, I'm taking a small liner brush and applying a lot of water to it and some paint. Then I'm peeling the brush back and launching all of this very wet pigment at the canvas. As you can see, it is rendering a number of stars, and this is something you could actually do before you put on the moon. I'm going to have to go in and clean up my moon just a little bit, but, you know, it just goes to show that we all make mistakes, and we can fix these mistakes as well. It's not a big deal. Don't ever worry about that sort of thing, because acrylic paints dry very quickly, and they're very easy to remedy because of that. So here I'm just adding more additional stars. I'm letting the paint run out on my brush, and you can kind of see now that there are different sizes of stars, which also makes it really interesting. There's also a lot of them, which is fantastic because could you imagine having to draw in every single little one of those? It would take forever. So this is a nice little method to just get things done much more quickly. From there, I'm going in and fixing my moon as I mentioned. I'm primarily adding a highlight with my liner brush to the edges because acrylic paint dries a little bit darker than what we initially see it as. And so you need to go back in and add those real highlights later on, generally, especially when you're working on a darker base color or a black canvas. Now, it should be noted that this canvas itself wasn't black initially. I did just paint it with black acrylic paint and then let it fully dry. Once it was dry, I did begin this painting. Now, like the moon, the mountains dried a little bit darker, so I'm taking a little bit of additional highlight and just working on the edges that are going to be receiving light. It's important to remember that this light is only going to hit a portion of the mountain, and so you don't want to make all of it bright, just the sides that are touching this very bright light emanating from the moon. Now from there I'm taking a medium-sized round-headed brush and applying a little bit of additional very vibrant blue to the edges of my moon. This is a primary blue, but I didn't kind of distort it with a lot of grays, and so it's really going to have a nice glow, and it's going to stand out much more so than the clouds at the bottom. But of course that light is going to reflect down on the bottom, so using very rugged strokes I'm also applying that and just creating the implication of more clouds. Now, much like our first darker layer of the clouds, these is going to be a little bit rough, but that's fine because we can always go back in and clean it all up. This is just to give us a good initial application. We have the dark, we have the light, and it's really creating depth. You'll notice that I'm really saving all of the brighter colors and tones for right under the moon. That's because that's where the light is going to be hitting it first and foremost, and then it's going to kind of dissipate as it moves backwards throughout the painting. So here I'm just kind of getting all of that additional paint off of my brush and kind of moving it around. We also want some clouds at a higher altitude, as this is really going to ensure that it doesn't look like a flat painting. Clouds don't simply exist on one plane. They're up, they're higher, they're lower, and again, it's going to make your painting more interesting and just add some additional layers of depth. I added it to both sides just to kind of balance it as well. So now I'm going in with a fairly wet brush without any additional paint, and I'm just moving around those highlights that I had and feathering the bottoms of them. And this is going to make the clouds look a little bit softer, and it's going to make it just appear much more natural. So from there I'm going back in and adding more of a vibrant blue to the outskirts of my moon, and it's all really a process here. Because, again, the paint dries so much darker, so you need to continuously go back in, add a little bit more, add a little bit more. And this process is actually fantastic, because it teaches you and it reminds you that you can go back, you can change things, you can add things, and it gives you time to think about them. Well, do I want to change that? Do I want to accentuate that? So it might seem frustrating at first to have to go back and rework on varying areas, but in the end it's really going to strengthen your piece. So here again, for the second or maybe even third time, I'm just applying a white highlight to the edge of my moon. I'm also doing it down on the edges of my mountains. And for a lot of this, you notice that I am using the liner brush. It's because it can create a lot of detail, and in these areas I don't need to apply a lot of paint. You'll also notice that the mountains closer to the moon are a little bit brighter than the one in the foreground, and that's also really important to remember, that everything closer to the moon needs to be just a little bit brighter than everything in the background and in the distance. So now I've actually decided to add a couple of very large stars in the distance, and I'm not adding too many of them. Don't go overboard with this. We already have a lot in the other sizes. But I just wanted to ensure that it's balanced, that you really do have all of these different clusters, and that some are going to appear much larger and much brighter in the foreground than others. Much like the clouds in the mountains, you want them of different sizes in different areas of the painting. So anyways, I cheated again as I always do. Here's an extra 2 minutes added on, and as it dried, you can really see how much more blue it is. There isn't that much of a reflection from the wet paint. It just worked out great. So thank you so much for watching. I truly hope you've enjoyed. If you liked this, if you'd like to see more, hit that subscribe button because I do post every Saturday. Thank you so much for watching and stay creative.